Hi everyone, welcome to Canyon Conversations on this wintry weekend. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe and warm out there. Today, I wanted to talk to you about a few sites within Logan Canyon and some of the history and kind of lore surrounding some of those locations. Logan Canyon is incredibly rich in history and a lot of fun stories and legends surrounding some of the different sites within Logan Canyon. There's so much history up there. I just picked 5 locations that we're going to look at today and learn a little bit about some of the history and legends surrounding it. We're not going to go into a full history of Logan Canyon. We'll save that for a future canyon conversation. So I won't even be touching on the history of the Shoshone or fur trappers in Logan Canyon. Instead, we'll be looking at just some of the specific sites and some of the really fun history and legends that surround those sites. So I hope it will encourage you maybe to put some of these sites on your list to explore maybe next spring or summer as we are heading into winter. Some of them are still accessible now though, but I wouldn't recommend going during our winter storm warning. There are avalanche warnings in effect this weekend if you are watching this weekend, November 14th. But let's go ahead and get started and look at these 5 sites. The first one I was going to talk to you about is the Wind Caves. I picked this one because it is so very well known. People that come from out of the valley, this is one of the few hikes that they always choose to do. That's really well known and pretty easily accessible. So the Wind Caves is located in the China Wall. It's that rock strip of limestone that you can see running along the canyon that looks an awful lot like the Great Wall of China. So the Wind Caves are about 900 feet off the canyon floor. They would have been carved while that was still underground from water seeping through that limestone and forming and expanding those caves. So despite the name the Wind Caves, they were actually formed by water. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about how it maybe got the name the Wind Caves instead of the Water Caves. So there is a legend dating back to about the 1920s surrounding the Wind Caves. About a woman or a witch that lived there, or maybe still does, and it was given the name Witch's Castle. The legend goes that there is a witch named Hecate who lives there. So if you happen to know your Greek mythology, Hecate is associated with witchcraft and the underworld in the Greek legends. So there are some stories and kind of some fun legends surrounding Hecate. Teenagers used to believe that if you went to Spring Hollow at nighttime and chanted Hecate's name, that she would appear. She would appear as a woman with long white hair wearing a long pale dress. And Hecate had the ability to kill car engines. So if you're a teenager, maybe you're not supposed to be out there at night, that might be kind of a spooky thought. Probably the most well-known story about Hecate was from a truck driver named Clyde, who was driving his pickup truck through Logan Canyon. It was near Third Dam when his truck unexpectedly died. And there was a woman standing in the middle of the road, long white hair, wearing a gray coat. Clyde frantically tried to restart the engine as the woman walked around the truck, looking in his window. Once she was behind the truck, he was able to restart the truck. But he said he was able to see her following in his rearview mirror, but it didn't look like she was running. Somehow she was following behind him. And it wasn't until he was out of the canyon that she disappeared, supposedly. So maybe you can hear Hecate's dogs if you're up there. The legend goes that you could hear her dogs at night. Probably what is happening is when the wind blows through those caves, it does make a really eerie sound that kind of sounds like the howling of maybe a supernatural dog that could belong to a witch like Hecate. So that's more how it got its name, is from the wind rushing through the caves and making that noise. Rather than wind forming it. As I mentioned, it was water. But maybe next time you're up there, you can think about Hecate. A great place to see the Wind Caves without actually hiking up to them is from Spring Hollow. Along the nature trail, you can look across the canyon and glimpse the Wind Caves. You might want to take a pair of binoculars with you to get a really good view of them from that side of the canyon. So we'll move on from the wind caves to our next location, which is the Jardine Juniper. So I think it's really fun to think about the Jardine Juniper and just all the history that this tree has seen. So samples from the Jardine Juniper dated to be at about 1,500 years old. It was discovered in 1923 by a student from what was then the Utah State Agricultural College. Her name was Maurice Linford. So the Jardine Juniper holds several records. It's on Utah's Big Tree Champion list as the largest Rocky Mountain juniper in the state, and it also is on the National Register of Big Trees. As far as is known, it's not only the largest tree in Utah, but also in the nation and probably in the world of its species, so of Rocky Mountain junipers. So it measures about 284 inches in diameter across its trunk, about 40 feet high. And though it might not look like much, if you look at this photo of Jardine Juniper, it looks kind of dead. Its foliage is kind of sparse. It is still alive. It's still growing. And it has just kept watch over centuries and centuries of change in the canyon, 1,500 years of change. So it has witnessed so much from the coming and goings of different people, Fremont, Shawnee traveling through, the arrival, traveling of the fur trappers and mountain men, to the arrival of the settlers who settled Cache Valley and Logan, to the development of the canyon, to what is part of the Cache-Uinta-Wasatch National Forest as we know it today. So it's pretty remarkable to think about all this tree is seen as it's grown from a sapling. If you want to see this, it is a bit of a hike to get to Jardine Juniper. So it's about a 9-mile round trip to get up to the juniper tree and back. But it is well worth it to reminisce and see this amazing old sentinel and think about everything that it has seen within the canyon. Our next location is the Temple Fork Sawmill site. So this is a historic photo of what the sawmill site looked like when it was actually in operation. So the sawmill operated from about 1884 to 1887. It provided all the lumber to build the Logan Temple and the Logan Tabernacle for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It also provided lumber for the Utah Northern Railroad Company and a lot of other things. If you travel to this site today, the mill burned down. It's no longer there, and they hauled most of the equipment out. So you'll see a monument marking where the mill actually was, and you can also see just a few iron remnants of things from the mill. But it's a beautiful, easy hike. It's only about a 5-mile round-trip hike. That's easy to do with the family. It's not steep. Beautiful beaver ponds along the way. You can access that from the Temple Fork turnoff off of the highway in Logan Canyon. So a little bit more about the sawmill. I told you it was in operation from about 1884 to 1887. Produced massive amounts of lumber, so about 2.5 million board feet of lumber, 21,000 railroad ties, shingles, countless broom handles, and fence pickets. The mill was in operation those years year-round. In fact, it was easier to move the lumber over snow using sleds sometimes than it was during the summer months. So winter months could be pretty productive up there. So besides the mill, it also would have had a bunkhouse and a cookhouse with workers there year-round. Would have been kind of a social hub that people would visit. Families might visit on holidays and weekends. They'd hold regular social events for the mill workers, things like dances. You can imagine there probably wasn't many women, so some of the history says that the men would tie ribbons around their arms to designate whether they would be the males or females at the dances for the workers. Other stories center around the oxen, so they would use teams of up to 12 oxen to transport the lumber from Temple Fork down the canyon to Logan. And the oxen could be pretty stubborn and hard to control animals. Most of the oxen used at the mill were donated from members of the church, and they were usually either older oxen or oxen that maybe just didn't have the best personality and that these people didn't want to work with, and so they'd send them up to the Temple Fork sawmill. And the bullwhackers were the individuals responsible for the oxen. And so they'd have a whip and kind of move the oxen. There's some fun stories about the bullwhackers. One story about one particular bullwhacker, he got very angry at his bulls, his oxen, and started swearing and saying some not so nice things to his oxen. But the story goes that the oxen behaved from then on because they knew they were church oxen and they were in trouble when they heard him talking like that. There's also stories about pack rats getting into the kitchen and being so loud that the workers weren't able to sleep at night. So the mill ceased operations a few years after the tabernacle and the temple were finished, and it mysteriously burnt down in the winter of 1886. The winter, the snow was so deep they weren't able to get in and investigate until the following spring. They saw tracks going in and out, and there was evidence of some kind of incendiary or explosive device. So kind of a mystery there of what happened and why the mill actually burned down, maybe a little foully there. Something for you to think about and a little mystery for you next time you visit the Temple Fork sawmill. What do you think happened? Why did it burn down? All right, so probably the most well-known legend in history out there is of old Ephraim. So this image is of old Ephraim's grave where he supposedly was buried. Now he's not buried there anymore. They went back, some scouts and dug him up, and the skull was sent to the Smithsonian. But this marks where he originally would have rested. So old Ephraim was the last known grizzly in this area of the country. Frank Clark was a sheep herder who eventually ended up killing him. He came to work in Logan Canyon in about 1911. And he said bears were pretty common then. But this year of 1911, about 154 sheep were killed that Frank was responsible in that first year. And he became pretty well acquainted with Old F, as he'd call him. Old Ephraim had a deformed foot, which is how Clark was able to recognize him, and he was a very large bear. He's grown in legend throughout the years. You'll see stories that say he was 9, 10, 11 feet tall. According to measurements from his actual skull, he was probably more like 8 feet tall, just still a very large bear, but not that 9, 10 foot bear that maybe you've heard of in legend. But still a large legendary bear. So old Ephraim would take sheep and eat them. And Frank started setting traps and tried to trap him for a whole year. He'd set traps in the wallows and places where old Ephraim frequented. So Frank Clark describes waking up on just a beautiful, clear, starlit night, being woken up by a roar and a groan. And Clark went to investigate. Thought initially that maybe a horse was in trouble, but he found old Ephraim instead. So old Ephraim had got caught in a trap, and Frank wrote that he was paralyzed by fear at first, but eventually he was able to raise his gun and did kill old Ephraim. That took about 6 bullets to do so. Frank Clark did regret killing old Ephraim. He wrote, quote, that I was not happy, or was I happy? No. If I had to do it over, I wouldn't kill him. I could see the suffering in his eyes. So I think anytime we look back at history, it's easy to sometimes judge the people involved. So if you think about if you were Frank Clark and protecting your livelihood, protecting your sheep, what would you have done? I think it's easiest for us to look back and think that maybe he shouldn't have killed old Ephraim, but he was trying to defend his livelihood, and it was a very different world back then. But old Ephraim, of course, lives on as this legendary bear of history that we still love to talk about and hear the story of old Ephraim today. So to get to the gravesite, it is quite a trek to get there as well. If you're hiking, you can hike there from a right-hand fork. If you do have a really good 4-wheel drive vehicle, you can also drive there following the Temple Fork or Canyon roads and get to his gravestone. And Utah State does have a replica of his skull. When we have the Nature Center renovated as well, we'll have a replica of Ephraim's skull there as well that you'll be able to come and see. So we look forward to having you come and see that when we reopen in the spring. All right, the last piece of history I wanted to share with you is a sad piece of Logan Canyon history. I thought it was appropriate though, having just had Veterans Day. So this occurred at Pass Hollow, which is located up near Beaver Mountain on January 6, 1953. And this was a plane crash. It was a C-46 plane carrying 37 soldiers and 3 crew members. They were soldiers returning from the Korean War. They were traveling from Seattle, Washington to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for these soldiers to return home to some of the southern states. So according to the flight log, it did end up carrying about 400 more pounds than it was designed for. It was a little heavy. The pilot radioed in at Malad City, Idaho, to the airport. That all was fine, but then they were never heard from again. So they sent out air patrols, of course, and search and rescue to search for the plane and found it at Pass Hollow. The plane had hit so hard enough it disintegrated on impact. There was no survivors and very little wreckage even of the plane. So from the direction the plane was headed, they think it was turning around to head back to Malad for an emergency landing. And they believe that ice forming on the wings is what caused the crash. So that ice interfered with the plane's lift and the ability to stay airborne. So since it occurred in January in the middle of winter, the snow was so deep and it was cold, they weren't able to get all of the bodies of those casualties out that winter. The Army had to set up a camp to protect the site until they were able to return those soldiers back home to their family the following spring. So something to think about as we just did celebrate Veterans Day, a little piece of history that we are tied to here in Logan Canyon. Those Korean War veterans that unfortunately did not make it home, but sacrificed and served our country during that war. I hope you guys did enjoy learning a bit about Logan Canyon. There's so much history to explore, a few mysteries and legends as well that can be really fun to explore. So I hope maybe this will give you a list of some places to try and make it to in the spring. And some of these places will still be a little bit accessible this fall, or if you have snowshoes. I wouldn't recommend going this Saturday with our winter storm warning. There's also some avalanche warnings in the canyon. So please do stay safe this weekend and warm. But we hope you will get out and explore throughout this winter, however we'd like to explore, whether that's snowshoeing or skiing. You can arrange for a snowshoe program with us at Stokes if you're looking to try out something new this winter. And if you're looking to learn about more in Logan Canyon, do check out some of our past canyon conversations. You can find them on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Stokes Nature Center. We've got some great ones from the past couple months. There's one, our most recent one was on the bats of Utah, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Utah's bat species. There's also one on the Utah Water Heritage Project being done by Utah State University. So both of those, we talk with experts on those two areas. We will see you guys again soon after Thanksgiving for our next canyon conversation. Everyone stay safe and well out there. Bye-bye.